In 1942, the Hamilton Watch Company of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, stopped producing watches for civilians so they could concentrate all their efforts on producing timekeepers needed for the military. Known as the Master Navigation Watch, this Hamilton 4992B is essentially a size 16 pocket watch with a 24-hour dial that was designed to be used as the master time indicator in airplanes. Some of these watches were available for pocket carry and came with a rubberized pouch, but the vast majority were fitted either in a wooden box if it was going to the Navy, or a box like this metal canister, which acted as a magnetic shield to protect from possible magnetization from fields inside the airplane. The watch was not secured by any mounting screws because of the necessity to remove it from the canister for daily windings and to be able to set the watch with the master time source. Because these were considered master timekeepers, the accuracy had to be impeccable, rivaling some of the top brands produced today. Once serviced, these watches were tested for 5 days. The daily rate in both horizontal and vertical positions could not exceed 5 seconds per day. The rate between dial up and dial down could have no more than a 0.2 second per day difference, and the vertical rates could have no more than a 2-second per day variation between their daily rates. So here we have a watch that was produced 80 years ago that has the same timekeeping standards as modern movements that are built with much more advanced equipment, with much higher degrees of technology behind them. And they were able to do this almost a century ago. My goal with this restoration is not to make it look like a new watch. I don't want to destroy the history that it has, because every dent and scrape on it has a story behind it. But what I do want to do is to restore this to the highest level of timekeeping that this watch is capable of. So let's get this restoration started right now. So we're going to start by taking out the 2 case screws. Now, one of the first things you'll notice is that the inner hour orbit or ring where the hour markers are numbered 1 through 24 instead of 1 through 12. They spec'd out a railroad style spade hand for the hour indicator and a long slender hand for the minute indicator. Now, one of the things that you might notice is that the dial has kind of a mottled look to it. And I'm not really sure at this point if that's dirt or if it's water damage, but all I'm really planning on doing is cleaning up the dial a little bit. I obviously don't want to risk damaging it. And I'm also not really trying to restore this watch to new condition. I don't want to take the historical value away from it. So we're just going to try to clean it up and see how it works out. So you can also see that we have a little bit of corrosion on the hour and minute hand. So I'm going to try to see if we can stop that from getting any worse and maybe reverse it a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started and take the dial off. You have the typical 3 dial feet screws that need to be loosened to remove the dial. And the one thing I will say is this is a pretty substantial dial, and the dial feet are very well soldered onto the underside of the dial itself. Now, there's a couple things that really stand out when you remove the dial. The first is the amount of teeth on the hour wheel here and the minute wheel. Since the Motion Works is a reduction train, it now has to slow the hour hand so it only makes one turn every 24 hours. And of course, before I go any further, I want to screw the dial feet screws back in so that they don't come out in the cleaning cycle. While I remove the cannon pinion, let me point the second thing that stands out on this movement. You'll notice the plate with two screws that holds the end stone for the balance wheel. You'll also notice a second plate with two end stones, and that's for the escapement, the escape wheel and the pallet fork. And when you see this in a movement, that's telling you that there's something pretty special going on. You may have noticed that when I took the hands off the dial, I didn't lay the movement on a case cushion. And that's because of this wheel that's sitting on top of the barrel bridge called the center seconds wheel. It's actually friction fitted on an extended pinion from the third wheel that comes up through the jewel. And what it does is it turns the center second pinion, which is what the sweeping second hand attaches to. So not only does the third wheel have to do its regular job and turn the fourth wheel, but now it also needs to have the power to be able to turn this center seconds wheel on top of it. All right, so to continue our disassembly, now we're going to remove the center seconds bridge. Now this bridge is jeweled, and it's actually the jewel that gives this watch 22 joules instead of 21. One of the things that you'll notice about this movement is some of the bridges are really tight. So I'm using a homemade lifting tool that I made out of brass, and the tweezers that I'm going to be using for this disassembly are going to be bronze. With the bridge removed, now we can remove the center seconds pinion. And this is something you're going to want to be very careful with because it's very thin. It's about 4/10 of a millimeter. So you want to be really careful with it. Now we can remove the stabilizing spring from the movement. And this is just held on with two screws. And basically what it does is it pushes up on the underside of the center seconds pinion to keep its pinion leaves engaged with the teeth of the center seconds wheel. Now we need to remove the center seconds wheel. So just in case you're wondering, this wheel has to be removed. You can't service the watch by taking the bridge off and leaving the third wheel along with this wheel in place. So to do this, I have a very simple tool that I made out of a brass rod and just basically ran a file to create a lip at the bottom of about 2/10 of a millimeter. And we're going to use a pair of these to gently pry up this friction fitted wheel off of the third wheel arbor. What's important here is that you want to lift the wheel or pry the wheel up as straight as possible so that you don't bend this extended arbor on top of the third wheel. In here you can see damage left behind from other people who have pried this off, who are not using brass or bronze and have scratched the metal. So now we'll go ahead and remove the balance wheel. And now we'll remove the pallet bridge and the pallet fork. If you're into watch repair, you've probably heard a million times that you never oil the pivots on the pallet fork. And in most cases, that's true. But here is one of those rare exceptions when you're supposed to. Now look at the shape of the pivot. This pivot has the same conical shape that a balance wheel pivot has. And the reason it does is because this goes in a olive jewel with an end stone, just like a balance wheel. If you look at the pivot on the right side, you see where the conical curves up until it gets to the arbor, and then you see a sharp corner. The reason that sharp corner is there is so that when the watch is in a vertical position, the oil will not creep up the arbor because that sharp edge on the outside of that arbor repels oil away from it. So that's why it's there. Probably one of the most common problems that you see in these movements when a watch won't wind is the fact that the screw for the crown wheel has been broken off. When you look at the wheel, there's nothing to indicate that the screw is a reverse thread. And the reason that it doesn't need to be is because under the wheel, there's this pin machined into the lower winding wheel. Now, while I remove this ratchet wheel, if you're new to watch repair, let me just speak for all my pocket watch collecting friends that this is not the type of watch you want to start off on. Not only does it have significant horological as well as historical significance, they haven't been making parts for this thing for over 80 years. And as pocket watches get worked on, things get damaged, parts become more and more scarce. So please save something like this until you have a little bit more experience under your belt. And now we'll move on to removing the click and the click spring, which are pretty standard, nothing special about them at all. Now we can remove the 3 screws that hold down the barrel bridge. And now we can remove the barrel bridge. And now we can remove the center wheel. And the mainspring barrel. And now we can remove the train bridge, which in this case only has one jewel for the 4th wheel, and it holds the jewel and cap jewel for the escape wheel. Now we can remove the 3rd wheel and check out its extended arbor on the top that the center seconds wheel friction fits to. And now we can remove the 4th wheel. And then finally, we can remove the escape wheel, which, by the way, has the same type of conical pivot that the pallet fork had. And now we remove the second setting lever, which is what provides the hacking feature. So as the crown is pulled, it pushes on the spring finger, which has a little spring on the end of it, which engages with the balance wheel, stopping the balance wheel, and then obviously the movement. It's held in place with 2 screws and the second setting lever maintaining plate. Now we can relieve the tension of the second setting lever spring. And then finally, we can remove the second setting lever itself. Now, before we flip the movement over to the dial side, I'm going to release the setting lever from the keyless works. And now we can flip the movement over. Now, in the keyless works, Hamilton uses a little bit of nomenclature that's a little different than what you may be used to. A lot of times, this part that I'm removing now is called a yoke spring, but Hamilton calls it a setting cap. Now, to remove the setting cap, I start by just loosening up the 2 screws that hold it. And then I'm going to release the tension at the end where it engages with the setting lever. And now we can just finish taking the screws out. Now we can remove the minute wheel. And then these 2 wheels they call the setting wheels, which often you would refer to these as just intermediate wheels. Now we can remove the tension of the clutch spring, which is another term that is a little different on this watch because normally you would refer to this piece here as the yoke, but for Hamilton in this movement, they use the term clutch lever. And the last thing to do is just to pull the stem out so that we can get the clutch out and the winding wheel. Now, to finish breaking down the movement even more, I'm a big believer that these cap plates that hold the end stones really need to be removed to wash the movement properly. So here's the one that is for the balance pivot. And then this one is for the 2 jewels of the pallet jewel and the escape jewel. So I'm going to take these off and we'll put them in a small wire basket for the cleaning machine. Now we can remove the cap that holds the end stone for the upper pallet fork jewel. Now we can remove the cap for the upper escape wheel jewel. Now, when I first took the balance wheel off, honestly, I forgot that we had to remove the hairspring to get to the cap jewel for the top of the balance. And with a movement like this, the safest way, at least for me, to do this is to mount it back onto the movement. And that way I can loosen up the hairspring stud screw, punch it through. And then it's just a matter of taking the balance cock off again and removing the hairspring so that now I'll be able to get to the balance capsule. Oh, and you don't want to forget to screw the hairspring stud screw back in. Otherwise, it's very likely that it'll get lost during the cleaning process. So now it's just a matter of removing the two screws from the underside of the balance cock and put those in our cleaning basket as well. And then the end stone cap on top of the balance will just fall right off. Now, as I remove the regulator, be extremely mindful of the regulator pins on the other side. These are very thin brass wire that are easily bent. So when I clean these parts, that part as well is going to be protected from getting damaged. So I'll probably put it in a basket completely by itself. Now with everything disassembled, I can go through and do a little pre-cleaning and peg out the jewel holes. And I'll do an inspection on the parts just to make sure that everything looks good. And I'm going to skip this on camera, but if I see anything that you might be interested in, I'll be back with it and then we'll wash our parts. Well, it didn't take me very much inspection to find some things that I thought you might be interested in. The first being the banking pins appear to be not parallel to each other. And typically that's going to be a problem. But I'm not going to make any corrections at this point because I don't know how it's affecting the watch. So we're just going to make a mental note of that and we'll come back to it if it's a problem later. We also have a broken jewel in the main plate. This is the lower jewel for the second wheel or the center wheel. So we're going to want to replace this before we wash our parts. And we also have a broken jewel setting. Now, it just happens that this is in the barrel bridge and this is the jewel for the third wheel where the extended third wheel pivot comes through. So I would imagine somewhere along the line, this probably got cracked when somebody was removing the friction fit wheel that attaches to the top of the third wheel pivot. And they just decided to leave this because these jewels are gold and they're a little hard to find. This cracked jewel perfectly illustrates the reason why you have to take off that center second wheel from the other side, the one that's friction fit onto the third wheel pinion. If I hadn't taken it off, I would have never discovered that this jewel was cracked. Not to mention the fact that you can't lubricate it when it's fully assembled like that. So I would have discovered this when I got everything done and I was at the point of regulation. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know that you can't regulate a watch that has broken jewels. So a watch movement like this, which is adjusted in 6 positions, you can't have a broken jewel and be able to adjust this thing. You just can't do it. So it's very important to really not skip any steps because, again, like I've said a million times, everything matters in watchmaking. So let's go ahead and let's replace a couple jewels. All right, well, we have 2 jewels that need to be replaced. So let's start off with the jewel for the center or second. Now, for whatever it's worth, when I'm getting ready to remove a jewel, I typically don't measure the depth of the jewel in the jewel hole because I'm going to test the interaction of the wheels after I get done. So really all I'm going to do is just kind of eyeball it and see where it is, and then I can make adjustments after that. There's a lot of debate about which jeweling tool is the best, but for the type of work that I do, I find that the Sights has a lot of advantages over the Horia style tool. Since the flat side of this jewel is basically flush with the plate, we're going to pick out 2 pushers. One that's slightly smaller than the jewel itself to push the jewel out, and then another pusher that's larger than the jewel that's going to come in contact with the plate and stop pushing the jewel there. So that should make the jewel flush. You may notice that I'm not using a stump under the movement because in this particular case, the movement is flat. And there's also a cutout or recess where the jewel is going to come out, so I don't really need to use a stump. Now I'm just going to line up the pusher on the center of the jewel. And just give it a slight push. And that's it. So now we need to take the existing jewel and we're going to grab some measurements off it to see what we need to replace it with. Now the first thing we need to do is measure the outside diameter of the jewel. I find, at least with these center jewels, that it's easiest to hold them just on a small brooch. And then using my micrometer, I can see what the outside dimension is. And this one measures out at 1.99 millimeters, or basically 2 millimeters. Once I have the outside dimension of the jewel, now I can just take the wheel and measure the pinion, making sure that I'm measuring the pinion that actually rides in the jewel to see what that dimension is. The center hole of the jewel is going to run anywhere from 1/100th of a millimeter to 2/100ths of a millimeter. And since our pivot's measuring out at 877 thousandths of a millimeter, we'll just step it up to the next available size, which is going to be 1 millimeter for the center hole. Now I've built up a pretty good supply of extra parts because what I've always done is whenever I buy a part, I always buy at least 1 extra, if not 2. And then to keep track of everything, I just use a very simple Excel spreadsheet, which I can have the caliber number that it goes to and the part number and actually what it is. And then that way I can filter it and I can sort through it to see if I have the part before I actually go and reorder it again. This particular cabinet is a Hamilton factory parts cabinet, probably from the 1940s or so. But it's one of the nicer ones, and it's actually what I use to store all my jewels in. So first I need to swap out my pusher to the larger size. Select the jewel that I'm going to install on the movement and lay it in place. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice about jewels like this is that one side is flat and the other side, the outside edge, has a slight round over to it. That's also the side that the oil sink is on. So when we put the jewel into the movement, we're going to put the side with the rounded edges into the hole so that we're pushing on the flat side of the jewel. Now, because the pusher is a little bit larger than the jewel, when we push down on it, it's going to push the jewel all the way in the hole, but it's not going to push it any further because it's going to hit the metal around the jewel and stop. So that should make the jewel flush. So all I'm doing now is just rotating the movement a little bit, and just to ensure that the jewel is sitting in the hole flat. And then we just give it a quick visual check, and that looks good for now. Now I'm just going to put in the center wheel and put the bridge on so that I can check the work. I want to just check to make sure that it's freely and that the jewel's not sitting at an angle. Now moving on to the jewel for the third wheel. This jewel is what you call a jewel setting. So this is the jewel that's set into a solid gold bushing, basically, that fits inside the hole in the plate. Now immediately you'll notice that the jewel's sticking out from the top and it's recessed on the underside of the plate. So we need to handle this one a little bit different. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I typically don't measure the jewel's position in the hole before I remove it. I just eyeball it because I know I'm going to have to go back and make some final adjustments. But if you do want to measure it, one method would be to use the micrometer. And what I'm doing is I'm measuring from the back of the plate to the top of the jewel. So now I have a reference number after I reinstall the jewel before I make any adjustments. Now with this jewel, we're going to handle it a little bit differently. I'm just going to use one pusher that we're going to use to push the jewel out and to reinstall the new one. And you want it to be a little bit smaller than the hole in the plate, but not so close to the metal that there's any chance of it hitting the metal or becoming stuck inside the metal. The next thing that's going to be different is now we need to use a stump. And because we have this raised part of the jewel setting, we won't be able to lay it on a flat surface. So the stump will be on the jewel press. And when we press out the jewel setting will actually fall into the stump. Now it's really as simple as making sure that the top of the jewel is sitting in the stump and then lining up the pusher with the flat side of the jewel and then slowly pushing it out. Now on my particular press, there's a cap at the bottom that the jewel sometimes falls out of. But this one was tight enough where it just kind of got stuck inside the stump. So I just tapped it out and it fell right out. Luckily, I have a pretty good supply of Hamilton jewel settings. So after looking up the parts number, here's our jewel. And then just for fun, I'll put it onto the pivot and see how it looks. And just like we did with the center hole jewel, we'll put the flat side up and the side with the curved edges will go into our plate hole. And again, just like we did when we were pressing out the jewel, we just line the jewel up over the stump, center the pusher on top of the jewel, and we're just going to slowly press it in about as far as I think it needs to go. Now this looks close, but I'm sure it's off a little bit, but doesn't really matter that much. But let's measure it and see how close I actually got. When I measured the previous jewel before we removed it, we were at 1.016 millimeter, and now we're at 0.936 millimeters. So I'm off about exactly 0.08 of a millimeter. The next step was a series of about 6 or 7 different adjustments to the different wheels to get the end shakes on the entire train just like I like it. So not only did I make additional adjustments to the jewels that we replaced, but I also looked at the other jewels belonging to the second, third, and fourth wheel and made adjustments to those because a lot of times the end shakes are excessive and I like to reduce them so that I have a little bit more stability in how the train runs. So what I'm doing now is checking the horizontal positions to make sure that my clearances are correct. Now our next step is going to be to polish the pivots. And we're going to do that with a process called burnishing. I'm using a tool that watchmakers have used for many years called a jacket lathe. Now, the job of the jacket lathe essentially is to hold the pivot steady while we run our burnisher across the pivot. And the burnisher is hardened steel that has very, very fine lines etched in it, very similar to a file. And basically, I'm pulling on a string that's wrapped around a pulley on the lathe. And as the wheel turns towards me, I push the burnisher across the pivot. The action of the burnisher moving in one direction and the wheel moving in the other direction essentially creates enough heat to be able to start stretching the metal so that it fills in the low spots that are on the pivot, getting rid of any small dents and scratches, leaving behind a mirror surface. Depending on how much wear or scratching a particular pivot has, you might spend anywhere from about 5 to 10 minutes per wheel once you get the hang of actually using the burnisher. Now I'll flip the second wheel over so that I can burnish the other side, or the other side of the pivot. Now that I have the wheel in place, I can locate the carrier in its correct position. And the carrier is going to basically fit on either side of one of the spokes on the wheel. And as I turn the drum with the string, the carrier moves the wheel back and forth. And now here's the third wheel with the extended arbor. And now I'm fitting on the fourth wheel. And then we just repeat the same procedure with the escape wheel and the balance wheel. Now I need to check to make sure all the wheels are concentric and flat and in plane. Here I'm using a figure 8 truing caliper to check the third wheel. And now we're going to check the fourth wheel. Now once we have the wheel set up in the caliper, we index the wheel with this metal gauge so that as we turn the wheel, we can see any difference between the spacing between that gauge and the wheel. And that way, if there's any bends in it, we'll be able to spot it immediately. Now, for the escape wheel and the balance wheel, we use what's called a Lyra style truing caliper. And this one has synthetic jewels, just like the watch does, that hold the pivots. So you can see I've got the escape wheel spinning, and just visually, it looks like it's spinning true. But just like on the figure 8 caliper, this also has a indexing gauge that we can get as close to the wheel as possible without touching it, and then we'll give it another spin and we can judge it. But you can see that this wheel is spinning absolutely true. Now, as I test the balance wheel, the reason that it's very important that these wheels are concentric is that any fluctuations, especially in the train, causes additional friction, and what you'll start seeing is rises in dips in amplitude, so you don't have a nice consistent amplitude, and that makes it very hard to, or impossible to even regulate a watch. So with a caliber like I'm working on, these are all the little details that are really going to make a big impact when we get this watch serviced and lubricated and start the regulation process. While I run all the parts through the ultrasonic machine, I just wanted to take a few minutes to thank all my patrons who've been supporting me for the last 14 months. It is because of your generosity that I'm able to continue with the mission of this channel, which is to really focus on learning and teaching watch repair. You know, most people don't have the luxury of going to a 2-year watchmaking school. And the problem with watch repair is that there's so many things where the information's just not out there. So you almost have to fly blind. And it's the patrons that support this channel that have really kept me focusing and continuing to make this a channel that's about teaching and learning the fine points of watch repair. You know, there's a million channels where you can watch someone take a watch apart and put it back together. But, you know, that's great for entertainment, but you don't really learn that much. Or you learn a little bit, but there's so much information that's just left out that you're wondering about. So that's kind of the focus that we've had on this channel since day one. And I think we're about 14 months into it right now. So thank you to all the patrons. I really enjoy your conversations that we have. And as an added benefit to some of the levels, I'm including early access to my new watchmaking course as I upload new lessons. Now, this is not a watchmaking course that's really about how to take a watch apart and put it together, even though that is going to be included. Well, what we're trying to do here is really dive deep into particular subjects like jeweling and using staking sets and all the fine things that you really need to know to be able to solve any kind of problem that you're going to run into while you're doing watch repair. So if you're a home watchmaker and this sounds like something you might be interested in, you can check out the links in the description to get more information. Now let's get on with the assembly. Starting with the keyless works, here I'm lubricating the screw for the setting lever. I'm using 9504 here. And notice how tight or well machined this is. The screw absolutely does not want to go in that hole. And now I can lay the setting lever in place, and to get the screw started, I just turn the movement holder on its side, and then I can get it started enough to hold it itself in place. Now we need to lubricate the stem. I'm using, again, 9504. A little bit on all four sides of the square part of the stem. Now when I install the winding pinion, I don't do any direct lubrication onto it. I'll add a little bit of grease to the winding stem to lubricate where the stem is making some contact inside the hole in the main plate. And as it spreads out, it'll transfer a little bit of that grease to the center of that winding. The next part is what Hamilton calls the clutch, which you're probably more familiar with the term sliding pinion. And to lubricate it, I just put a little bit of grease on a piece of glass and then just rub the ratchet teeth over it, and that'll pick up just enough to lubricate it and the winding pinion as well. Now I'm just adding a little bit of grease where the pin on the underside of the clutch lever is going to come in contact with the clutch. We just put a little bit of grease on the post for the clutch lever. And then a little bit of grease where clutch lever is going to come in contact with the setting lever. And now we can put that in place. As you're looking at this, a lot of you are going to want to say, well, that's the yoke. Typically, that's what you would call it. But in this particular case, Hamilton calls that the clutch lever. Now I can lubricate the post for the motion works. And install the setting wheel, the intermediate setting wheel, and then of course the minute wheel. These of course being the gears that transfer the motion when the crown is turned for setting the time. Now here I am installing the spring for the clutch lever. And then we have this piece called the cap spring. And this is what holds the winding wheels down as well as the minute wheel, and is most often referred to as the yoke spring. And it's just held down with these two screws. Now, what I typically do is screw it down just until I feel a little pressure. And then I go back and I snap the spring in place to the setting wheel. And then finish tightening it down. And now finally, we just want to check the functionality of the keyless works to make sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to. Well, now we can lubricate the caps for the escapement. This is the cap that holds the end stones for the escape wheel in the pallet fork. And we're just lubricating them as normal with 90-10. Oh, now when you're screwing down these caps that hold these end stones, it's real important that their screws are tightened down to the proper torque. Otherwise, it can cause a whole bunch of different problems. If the end stone is not sitting flat, then that causes the balance staff to sit at an angle. So when the balance wheel oscillates, one vibration will be a little bit longer than the other, and that'll cause problems in bead error. Also, if the balance staff is at an angle, it can come in contact with the jewel hole itself, or in some cases, come in contact with the one side of the jewel setting. And of course, both of these things make it impossible to regulate the watch. The other issue in a movement like this, where now you have capsules on the pallet and escape wheel, now you're looking at inconsistent power transmission to the balance wheel. And again, anytime you have something like that going on, you really can't regulate the watch. Now moving on to the balance side, we'll start with the hacking feature, which Hamilton calls the seconds setting lever. And now we can install the second setting lever spring. And if you're wondering what I'm holding the spring down with, that's the same leather buff that I sometimes use when I'm cleaning my end stones. And this works really well for holding springs down so they don't fly away. And then finally, the second setting lever cap, which holds everything into place. Now, as we move on to the powertrain, there's a definite order that you want to install the wheels. So this is the fourth wheel that I just put in the mainspring barrel. Doesn't matter when you put that in. But here's the third wheel with the extended pivot on top of it. And then, of course, the center wheel, or second. Now we need to assemble the winding wheels onto the bridge. There's a lower winding wheel and an upper winding wheel. Now, normally, if you're working on movements, you're going to know this as the crown wheel, but Hamilton's setup is a little bit different. And it's because of this difference, you'll notice that the screw that holds this assembly together is not reverse threaded like you would typically see. This is just a normal screw. So here's the lower winding wheel with its pivot. And then I just put it on top of a little bit of Rodica to hold it in place. And then we can install the upper winding wheel, which has the hole that the pin in the lower wheel goes into. And it's this pin and this wheel that's made in two sections that enables it to have just a normal threaded screw in. With that assembled, now we can just lay the barrel bridge in place. And the reason that I'm laying it in place by hand is because I don't want to take any chances of actually dropping this heavy barrel bridge on that extended pivot on the third wheel, which in the best case scenario would bend it, but it might just break it altogether. And then I'll just use a couple screws to hold everything in place until I get the other bridge for the train situated. Now, it might be worth noting that when I'm initially putting the bridges on, I'm tightening the screws down only enough till I feel resistance, and then I stop. And then once all the bridges are in, and I've verified that the train is turning freely, so I know all the pivots are in the holes, then I go back and tighten all the screws down to their final torque. That way I know that I'm not breaking or bending any pivots. Now checking the capsule for the escape wheel to make sure it's perfectly clean. We oil it the same as the other capsules with the 9010. Being extra careful when we lay it in place not to disturb our oil on the capsule. We don't want it spreading around. And this is just going to be held on with one screw. Here's the capsule for the pallet fork bridge. Same oil, 90-10. And then we can put that in place as well. As I'm installing the pallet fork bridge, you need to line up the steady pins with the holes, being, again, very careful, making sure that the pivot is in its jewel hole, because these are extremely easy to break. And then we'll lightly tighten the screws down and then check the action of the pallet fork one more time before finishing our final tightening of the screws. Now we move on to assembling the balance. This is the capsule for the upper balance wheel pivot. It's already been oiled with 90-10. Then it's just a matter of lining it up and installing the 2 screws that hold it into place. So to install the regulator now, I find it easiest to remove the top screw from the regulator spring, and then we're going to just loosen up the second screw so that I can move it back and forth. And you'll also notice that the actual regulator screw, that long screw, is screwed all the way out, so it's not going to interfere with the regulator going back into position. So now with the regulator spring out of the way, we can gently lay in the regulator, being very mindful of the very soft brass index pins. And then it's just a matter of pushing down on it to snap it in place. And I'm using my bronze tweezers. Now I'll just move it over to the far left, and then we can swing the regulator spring back into position, and then just gently separate it with our bronze tweezers so that the regulator arm is in between the 2 parts of the spring. Now we just reinstall our top screw, screw it down, and then tighten up the back screw. Now with the regulator firmly on the balance cock, we can turn the regulator screw so that we can get the regulator arm centered in the regulator. And there we go. For me, I find it easiest to reinstall the hairspring looking down onto the balance so that I can line up the coil of the hairspring so that it falls in between the regulator pins. And then once I have the stud in place, then it's just a matter of screwing it down. And then we're ready to install it into the watch. Before I install the balance wheel, I'm going to lubricate the pallet stones with a little bit of 9014. And I'm just going to put a small dollop to the middle top part of the jewel. And then we're going to run 3 teeth of the escape wheel through it. And then we're going to add another drop, run 3 more teeth through it, and we'll repeat that 5 times until all the teeth have been lubricated. Now, to help distribute the oil onto the teeth evenly as possible, what I'm going to do is run the teeth through the pallet stones about another 30 or 40 times, and then we'll install the balance wheel. Now, it's been a while since I've serviced one of these, and I looked at my lift angle for this movement, and I looked it up online, and I saw a lot of different things. And I have 44 as the lift angle, so just to make sure, I did the test. I put a dot on the balance wheel and then filmed it in slow motion until the balance wheel was oscillating at 180 degrees, and the lift angle is for sure 44 degrees. And now I could just finish lubricating the second wheel, third wheel, and fourth wheel, and then we're going to let the watch run for 24 hours. But in the meantime, this is the time grapher reading straight after service, after I just lubricated those jewels. You can see the trace lines look pretty straight. We have a little bit of beat error, which will correct that. And our amplitude's a little low. I'm expecting that to go up after the 24-hour period. And of course, the rate's off a little bit. So let's let it run for 24 hours. And in the meantime, I'm going to swap out the crystal. Now, this is my GS crystal press. I always use this when I'm replacing either compression type crystals. So it works very simply. You've got a pusher on the top, you put a die on the bottom, you push down, it flexes the acrylic crystal, and it comes right out of the bezel. Now, installing it is just as easy. You fit the crystal with the front of the crystal facing down. You put the bezel right on top of the new crystal, push down. I like to give it a little spin and it'll find its groove. And when you let go, the crystal is inside the bezel. Doesn't get any easier than that. So after letting the watch run for a 24-hour period, the amplitude was well under 190 degrees. It was more around 140, 150, which told me that there's a problem with the mainspring. So I went ahead and opened the barrel, and what you're looking at on the bottom is the mainspring that was in the barrel. The mainspring that you're looking at the top of this picture is a brand new mainspring for it. And I think it's pretty clear that the lower mainspring that was in the barrel is too long. So what I believe was happening was that we weren't getting enough wind on the mainspring, because I think the power reserve on this movement is around 52 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this mainspring with a new one, and then we'll give it another 24 hours to see where we're at. All right, so back at the bench, The watch movement has been running for a little over 24 hours with the right size mainspring in it. And when you're adjusting and regulating, you always want to let the movement run for at least 24 hours before you start really looking at taking any serious readings to make any kind of adjustments. So we're going to switch over to the eTimer software now, because this is going to be a little bit more accurate than my Weishi time grapher that I just take rough measurements on the bench with. But for regulation, I like this a lot better. It gives me a lot more information as well. So the way I've got it set up is that I'm testing all 6 positions, and it'll tell me what position I need to be in. And then once it's in that position, it will let it settle in for about 20 seconds, and then it'll start recording the data, and it'll do that for another 30 seconds, and then it'll tell me to switch to the next position. And then when we're all done, we'll get a readout of all 6 positions to see where we're at. So I'm not going to make you sit through this whole thing. I'll go ahead and fast forward it and be back with you when we get our numbers. Now that we have the amplitude in an acceptable range, we can start the process of adjusting and regulating this movement. Now, the first thing you'll notice is in the horizontal positions. Those are positions 1 and 2. You'll notice that there's a 5-second difference in those positions. When you look at the amplitude on the dial up side, you'll notice that it's 12 degrees different, or 12 degrees lower than the dial down position. And what that's telling you is that there's something on that pivot or that end stone that's causing additional friction, which is lowering the amplitude. And this lower amplitude is what's creating a slightly faster rate on the dial up position. So that's the first thing we want to address. Now, if this was a low grade movement, I probably wouldn't worry too much about it because, there's only so many things you can do on a low grade movement, but this is a very high grade movement. And before we can even address the vertical positions, we need to try to even that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the end stones. I'm going to re-clean them and re-lubricate those. I'm going to clean off the tips of the balance pivots to make sure that there's no dust or anything there. And then I'm going to re-inspect them to see if one is a little flatter than the other. And by doing this, we should be able to bring this rate closer together. Okay, so we're back to the time grapher, and we're going to check horizontal positions only. So I cleaned the end stones and re-lubricated them. They look pretty close, but one looked like it might have been smeared a little bit. I didn't notice any dust, but sometimes you don't see it. And I also cleaned off the balance pivots, and I didn't see any problems there. So it's a little difficult to say exactly what it was, but obviously you can see on the data that we have now that our horizontal positions are within a fraction of a second each, And even though we have a slight difference in amplitude, that's pretty normal. So now that we have the horizontal positions equalized, now we can work on the vertical positions. Now, when we talk about dynamically poising a balance wheel, basically what we're referring to is we're going to balance the balance wheel. We don't want any heavy spots because a heavy spot on a balance wheel will produce a poise error, which shows up in the vertical positions. Poising errors do not show up in the horizontal positions. They show up in the vertical positions only. The first thing we need to do is get some timing readings of the vertical positions. But we're going to do this at between 170 and 180 degrees because it's at this range of amplitude where poising errors are amplified. They become more obvious and they stand out the most. Poising errors are not obvious at all when the amplitude is 220 degrees, and they're minimized at higher amplitude. So we want to take these readings, like I said, right around 170 to 180 degrees of amplitude. When we take these readings, we're no longer going to use the crown as our reference point. Now we're going to use the position of the escape wheel as our reference. The reason we do that is because the heaviest point on the balance wheel will be in relationship to where the escape wheel's position is on the microphone stand that has the fastest rate. And what we're going to be looking for is the point on the balance wheel that's directly below the balance staff. So as you can see, I have the movement mounted into my microphone stand. So the escape wheel is directly below the balance staff. And this is where we're going to start taking our readings. Now, we're actually going to take 8 positional readings. We're not concerned with dial up, dial down, any of that stuff. So what you're looking at is we're measuring the positions. And this is position 1. And then the next position is going to be 45 degrees to the right of that position. The third position will be 90 degrees to this. And then we're just going to rotate it around until we've gotten 8 different readings. Now, you don't need a microphone stand to do this like I'm doing it. You can do this on the Wi-Fi as well. If you've ever played with the microphone stand, you know that it will pull up 8 different vertical positions. Now you can see we're in position 2, and then we'll go to position 3 and we'll go all the way through it. Now, on the E-timer, I can only record 6 positions on a readout. So the last 2 positions, 7 and 8, I'll need to just run it and then write those down manually because there's no way to record 8 positions.
Wow, you're not. Wow, sweet. Dang, we have a book. Sweet. That's nice. That's nice. That is great. I might have around too. Oh, yeah, yeah. I'll take it.
Once I have my time grapher readings, I'll make a very simple chart on paper to keep track of the positions and the rate in each one of those positions. And what we're looking for is we're looking for the position that has the fastest rate. So in this particular example, you can see that position 3 has a rate of 38.36. But there is situations where all these numbers might be negatives. So in that situation, what you're looking for is you're looking for the highest negative rate. So as an example, if you had a position that was -1 and everything was above -1, then -1 would be the fastest rate. All right, so now we mount the movement back onto the mic stand. This is position 1. This is position 2. And then this is position 3. And this is where we have the highest rate. So we let down the power to the movement, so the balance isn't moving, it's at rest. And you can see our escape wheel's position. And what we're looking at is straight down the balance staff, or the jewel where the balance staff is. And we're going to make a mark on the balance wheel directly under. Now we can take the balance wheel and we're going to adjust the timing screw, but we're only going to turn it 1/4 of a turn. And then we're going to wind up the watch again. We're going to let it run. We're going to run it through all 8 positions again. And we're going to repeat this process. So here we are, about 2 hours later, and 8 cycles or 8 rounds of adjustments on the timing screws to get where we are now. Although poising a balance wheel isn't hard, it is very time consuming. And you have to make very small adjustments. Now, I say it's not hard, but there's many variables that come into play. If you're lucky, the heavy spot will fall right on top of a timing screw, but often not. And in the case that we had, the heavy spot actually kind of fell between 2 timing screws. So the way you go about adjusting that is completely different. There's also scenarios where you have to actually add weight with timing washers. And that's a whole other subject. I could literally spend 2 hours just talking about dynamic poising. So it's a little bit more than what we can do here. But in our watchmaking course, we're going to cover this subject in detail. The process basically consists of letting the power down, removing the balance wheel, making the adjustment, going up to a full wind, and then getting all 8 readings again, making an adjustment, and then repeating this process over and over. Now, to get the rate that I have now, this took me 9 attempts, 9 adjustments, a little bit at a time, to dial this in to get it where we are right now. And it took 2.5 hours, honestly, to do it. So let's look at our data. Let's start with the delta rates. Now, delta rates are the difference between the highest and lowest. And for a watchmaker, it's really considered the most important factors, because if you regulate a watch and you got a dial down position of 0, but all your pendant positions are minus 25 seconds or whatever, the watch isn't going to keep very accurate time unless it's sitting on a desk all day. So with this particular movement, we got a delta of 2.15 seconds per day. And that's the difference between the dial down and pendant up position. The delta for horizontal rates is only a difference of 1.25 seconds per day, so that's obviously good. Our delta between the pendant positions is 2.0 seconds a day, which is also very good. And our delta between amplitude, so this would be the difference in the highest and lowest amplitude, is 48.7 degrees. Now, it's a little bit higher than I would like, but you're going to experience amplitude drops between horizontal and vertical positions, and really the bottom line becomes the rate. So I'm not going to really worry about that. Now, when we look at the means rates, and means rates are the overall performance of the watch. So our overall rate, averaging in all 6 positions, is 1.37 seconds per day. Our average beat error over all the positions is 2.37 seconds per day. And our average amplitude over all 6 positions is 241.8 degrees. So all is good. So now let's go ahead and we will just get the final assembly of this movement done, get it back in the case, and we're going to call this one good. To lubricate the center wheel arbor, I like to use 9504. And some of you are probably wondering why I use that when a lot of times oil's recommended. Well, oil really needs something to keep it in place. Just like on that conical pivot on the balance wheel, or the one that I showed you on the escape wheel, that sharp corner is what keeps the oil from spreading. And when you put oil on a smooth surface that has rounded edges, that oil tends to migrate. So I've been using 9504 in areas like this for a long time, and it works awesome. So now I install the hour wheel, and I'm going to go ahead and put the dial on now and tighten up the dial screws. Now with the dial in, I can insert it into the case and install the stem. And now I'm just tightening up the setting lever screw to hold the stem in place. To protect the dial while I finish up the movement assembly on the other side, I'm just going to put the bezel and crystal on. Now I can install the 2 case screws. Now to finish up the assembly on this side, I'm going to put in the spring stabilizer and the 2 screws that hold it into place. Next, I'm going to lubricate the center second pinion so we can install that. Now I could install the bridge for the center second pinion. And just checking to make sure the top pivot's in the jewel hole. Now we can lubricate that with 9010. And then finally we can install the center second wheel. So I'm just going to lay it in position on top of the extended pivot. And I'm just going to check to make sure that the teeth are meshed. And to kind of check the location of where the teeth of the wheel are sitting in the pinion leads. And now I'm just going to press it into place. And then I can check my position to make sure that it's correct. Now I did all this with the hacking feature on, but now I just want to see that center second wheel turn. And it all looks good. So now I'm going to protect that side of the movement by putting the back on, and now we'll install the watch hands. Now I already cleaned these up the best I could. So we'll start with the hour hand. Just getting it into place. And now we can push it down onto the hour wheel. Now I'm just checking the action of the hour wheel and make sure that it's turning correctly and it looks horizontal to the dial. And now we can put the minute hand on. Now with the hour hand pointing directly up to the 60-second or 60-minute marker, I can line up the minute hand. And we're just going to lightly push it down with my tweezers to get it to hold a little bit into place on the cannon pinion. And now I'm just going to nudge it over so that it's centered on the 60 marker. There we go. And now we can press that home as well. Now I'm going to check the alignment of the hour and minute hand. Make sure there's no interference between the two. Now I'm checking the alignment at the top of the hour. And now I'm going to lay the hour hand on the 2 so that it's centered, and check the minute hand again at the 60 marker. And that looks perfect. or at least as perfect as these old hands are going to get. And then finally, the second sweep pan. And now I can push the crown in and watch the sweep. So just blowing off the dial. Now we can put the crystal and bezel back on. Installing it into its canister. And that, my friends, is how you service a Hamilton 4992B. See you next time.